Of the more than 2,000 men who fought and died on this mountain, exactly one was born in Britain, and that one man was the officer who gave the order: burn their homes, hang their leaders, and show no mercy. Everyone else on that ridge, on both sides of the guns, was American, neighbors, former friends, men who had once traded horses and shared harvests, now killing each other over a letter one of them had written in a fit of arrogance. This is the story of how one of the British Empire's most brilliant officers, a tactics genius and pioneer of revolutionary weaponry, personally wrote the script for his own execution. He thought he was sending a warning. He was actually sending an invitation to his own death. To understand why Kings Mountain became such a slaughterhouse, you have to look at Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson was no mindless brute. He was an intellectually gifted, fiercely brave, and deeply ideological Scottish officer. He invented one of the world's first breech-loading rifles, capable of firing 6 rounds a minute, an astonishing feat for the 18th century. He understood warfare inside and out, but he possessed one fatal vulnerability: professional arrogance. General Charles Cornwallis tasked Ferguson with organizing a Southern Loyalist militia composed of locals loyal to King George III. Ferguson succeeded brilliantly, building a disciplined, loyal force. However, beyond the mountains, in the wild frontier of the Appalachians, lived a people Ferguson utterly despised: the Overmountain Men. They were not traditional soldiers. They were hunters, woodsmen, and rugged frontiersmen accustomed to surviving brutal conflicts with native tribes, answering to no government. To Ferguson, these men were uncivilized barbarians. He believed a single display of force would scatter them like dry leaves. So he sent a captured rebel back across the mountains with an explicit ultimatum. If they did not lay down their arms, he would march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. This is where the psychological tragedy lies. Ferguson anticipated fear. He was used to civilians choosing compliance when faced with a regular army, but he completely misread the psychology of the frontier. His ultimatum didn't intimidate the mountain men. It liberated them from hesitation. When Ferguson's letter was read aloud at frontier gatherings, the reaction was instantaneous. The Overmountain Men didn't hold councils or send envoys. They understood the core message. The enemy was leaving them no alternative. If they didn't march to meet him today, he would come for their families tomorrow. They assembled at Sycamore Shoals. No fancy uniforms, no marching bands, just hundreds of men in hunting shirts and coonskin caps, carrying long deck-hard rifles. Their rifles deserve special attention. British and Loyalist troops carried smoothbore muskets equipped with bayonets, built for fast volley fire at close range. The frontiersmen carried hunting rifles, slow to reload, but lethally accurate at distances that made European military officers sweat. The mountain men didn't march like an army. They rode like a hunting party. They moved with frightening speed, crossing snow-covered mountain passes and riding for days through freezing rain. When Ferguson realized that instead of terrified farmers, an army of vengeful professional hunters was closing in on him, his confidence wavered. He began to retreat, sending urgent requests to Cornwallis for reinforcements. But the Overmountain Men were closing the gap faster than he could move. Realizing he couldn't outrun them, Ferguson fell back on textbook military doctrine. He took up a defensive position at the summit of Kings Mountain, a steep, rocky, oak-covered ridge. By his own men's later accounts, Ferguson declared that he was king of that mountain, and that God Almighty himself could not drive him from it. He played strictly by classic European tactics, and once again he made a fatal mistake. October 7th, 1780. A cold, foggy morning. Ferguson arrayed his 1,000 loyalists along the crest of the mountain. From a traditional military perspective, the position was formidable. The enemy would have to climb up under heavy fire, only to be crushed by disciplined bayonet charges. But the frontiersmen had no intention of playing by European rules. They surrounded the base of the mountain. Lacking a single supreme commander, they relied on seasoned captains and individual initiative. They dismounted, took cover behind trees and boulders, and began stalking up the slope just as they would hunt game in the forest. The trees and rocks Ferguson relied on for defense became perfect cover for the hunters. Whenever the Loyalists launched a bayonet charge down the hill, the frontiersmen simply retreated down the slope, staying just out of reach of cold steel. As soon as the Loyalists grew exhausted and turned to climb back to the crest, the frontiersmen emerged from behind the trees and shot them in the back. This cycle repeated 3 times. The summit Ferguson considered a fortress turned into an open shooting gallery, enveloped in thick, suffocating gun smoke. Ferguson rode back and forth on his horse, frantically blowing a silver whistle to signal his crumbling lines. That silver whistle became his beacon of doom. Within 45 minutes, Ferguson's defense collapsed. Realizing his textbook plan had fallen apart, Ferguson refused to surrender. Instead, he drew his sword and led a desperate final cavalry charge straight into the American line. In an instant, dozens of frontier rifles locked onto his bright uniform and the sound of his silver whistle. At least 8 musket balls struck Ferguson simultaneously. He was blasted out of his saddle, his foot caught in the stirrup, and his terrified horse dragged his lifeless body across the bloody rocks. The one Englishman on that mountain was now the only man on either side who would never see home again. With their commander dead, the surviving Loyalists dropped their weapons and raised white flags. Here, the story reaches its darkest point. The frontiersmen, remembering Ferguson's threats and past British atrocities, ignored the white flags. Shouts echoed across the peak. "Remember Waxhaws, give them Tarleton's quarter." For several terrifying minutes, enraged militiamen shot surrendering men at point-blank range. American officers had to risk their own lives, physically placing themselves between their men and the prisoners to prevent a complete massacre. The Battle of Kings Mountain lasted less than an hour. Out of Ferguson's command, virtually no one escaped. Over 200 were killed, and the rest were wounded or captured. American losses numbered fewer than 30. The ultimate impact, however, was psychological. When General Cornwallis learned that his entire left flank had been wiped out by a mob of frontier hunters, he went into shock. He halted his invasion of North Carolina, lost critical momentum, and was forced to fall back. Kings Mountain isn't just a story of tactical victory, it is a lesson in human arrogance. Major Patrick Ferguson was convinced he held all the cards because he had uniforms, discipline, and the high ground. He failed to understand one fundamental truth. When you threaten to destroy a person's home, you create an enemy who no longer cares about the rules of engagement. He thought he would teach the frontier to fear him. Instead, he simply taught them how to hunt him down. And of the 2,000 men who fought that day, he was the only one who had crossed an ocean to die on that hill. What do you think? Was Kings Mountain a tragic civil war or a necessary act of vengeance? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories where history reveals its brutal truth.